Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me well. My name is Professor Tara Dean, and it is my pleasure to be chairing this afternoon's session. I am a Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise at University of Brighton, and I also chair the UUKi's International Research and Development Network. Welcome to you all, and this event today will look at two key aspects of research for international development. Firstly, we look at demonstrating ODA compliance post-award, and then second part, we will look at due diligence on international partners. In fact, this event is part of a series of events. There are 3 in the series of online events on research and innovation for global development. It's really aimed at researchers and research services staff who are interested in this particular area and involved in this type of research. The session has been jointly organized and delivered by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, and Universities UK International, UUKI. It's excellent to have this online event because it's actually over 300 individuals have joined this event, which is quite a feast. So there are some advantages of holding these events online as well. We have also, I want a particular welcome to our international partners who have also joined us for this session, and I hope they will find the session informative and helpful. If you want to tweet about the event, please use the hashtag ODA funding in your tweets, and you already see there are few tweets with that particular hashtag. So just before we start, a few housekeeping rules. Everyone in the audience is muted and videos are off. You as delegates should really use the question function to ask questions during the Q&A event. And if you do have any question, it would be excellent if you could also put your name and your institution as well. The event is going to be recorded, and following the event, there would be a link sent to the entire video recording of the events together with slides and any resources that the speakers would be referring to. It will be on to UUKI's YouTube channel. So the first part of the event, we will concentrate on demonstrating ODA compliance post-award. And it is really my great pleasure to start that first half by introducing our first speaker, Bisi Adekunle, who is Head of Research and Innovation in the Programme Management Office for Official Development Assistance, ODA, at the UK Department for Base Energy and Industrial Strategy. And if I could invite her now to do her presentation. Bisi, over to you.
Thank you, Tara. That was an excellent introduction. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. As Tara said, my name is Bisi, and as you can see on the screen, I'm with the UKRI BEIS ODA team. My role is Head of ODA PMO. I've only got 10 minutes for this session, so perhaps later on, if we have time, I'm happy to answer questions about the team. But what I'm going to try and do is to actually give you a really high-level summary of what BEIS as an ODA funder does, but in terms of the life cycle of programs, funding programs. So I will focus on the the funding of programmes between BEIS and the BEIS delivery partners, and my colleague Ruhena will follow and give you a summary to follow on the post-award process between delivery partners and award holders and award beneficiaries. Okay, so onwards, next slide please. So I'm hoping that at the end of this, you will all have a good overview of what the ODA funds are from a funder's perspective, from a BEIS perspective, and that includes the international context of what is ODA, what the standard is, as well as what the ODA funds are within the UK, and how we try and make sure that we, throughout that funding allocation process between BEIS and the delivery partners, we ensure that the funds are used for ODA eligible programmes only. The second part will be about what is compliance. Some terms are used interchangeably, so we'll cover that from a funder's perspective as well. And hopefully you'll get an idea of why the ODA rules are important and how we try and ensure that we are compliant with those rules, how we assure compliance, and how that is evidenced, as well as some of the roles and responsibilities across the team. So hopefully that will give you a high-level summary of ODA funds within internationally and within the UK, and ODA compliance as well. So next slide, please. It's a little bit tricky because I think the audience will be a mixed audience between some very experienced award holders who know everything about ODA, and perhaps some people who aren't quite as familiar. So forgive me if I'm sort of go over ground that you're familiar with, and I'm teaching, you know, what you want to say, outlining what you already know, but it's just to make sure we cover both ends of the spectrum. So this slide is really about saying what the context is for ODA. So ODA stands for Official Development Assistance. It's the international standard for, well, the gold standard really for foreign aid. And that definition of what is ODA is actually quite a technical and fixed definition. It's quite strict, and that definition is not guarded but defined, held by the Development Assistance Committee at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's the OECD organisation, and it's their DAC committee. The term ODA has been a reference for foreign aid. Well, the financing of development aid really is the main source, and it's also a key measure used in most aid targets and assessments of aid performance. The one-line summary for ODA is that any spend that's reported as ODA must meet the ODA eligibility definition and criteria as defined by OECD DAC. So there is a definition that all programmes that BEIS funds as ODA must meet that, must meet the criteria, the standard, the definition that the OECD DAC have laid out. Essentially, it's a financial metric that involves both the programme. There are different programme markers, and also the financial spend. In terms of what BEIS does, there is also a very high level one-line summary about what an ODA eligible research activity is. It's not really helpful from a discipline perspective, as it focuses more on the funder, essentially, that the funder is a government department and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So ODA is really an international standard defined by the DAC, and it's important because it defines what BEIS can fund, the types of programs BEIS can fund. And the reason why it's important in the UK is that the UK has currently, maybe about to change, currently a legal requirement to spend 0.7% of gross national income on ODA programs. So that's the left-hand side of the screen, as you can see here. There are other aspects of ODA compliance, but they are mainly domestic. So within the International Development Act, for example, we have that is where the legal commitment, the UK legal commitment sits, but there are also additional UK objectives for ODA spend in terms of poverty reduction, advancing development. They're not in opposition, they're quite well aligned. So that's quite good, but in terms of the compliance aspects, it's the OECD DAC definition that's key. There are also other aspects that touch on impose the requirement on ODA spend from the IDA, International Development Act, for example, ensuring that research takes a leading role in addressing challenges identified by the UN SDGs. So that's one aspect. There are also aspects about gender and making sure that ODA spend reduces poverty and addresses gender inequalities as well. So that's the first part. In terms, that's the sort of wider context for ODA. In terms of the UK context, BEIS is one of at least half a dozen cross-Whitehall departments that are allocated from Treasury money to spend on ODA programs. BEIS is the second largest spending department alongside FCDO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. That's important because it means that across the UK, what we need to do is to ensure that when we report our ODA spend, that we only report programs that comply with DAC's definition, the OECD DAC definition. The FCDO, so I'm trying not to say DFID, the FCDO have the role in coordinating reporting across all ODA spending departments and reporting that up to the OECD DAC through the Statistics in International Development return, which is an annual return that says how much ODA, what programs, the UK has spent on ODA. In terms of the sort of research aspects, it's quite interesting because FCDO are and have been for a number of years the key spender in the UK of ODA funds. They spend about 73%, and the 27% is shared, the balancing 27% is shared across other ODA spending departments in the UK. And within the sort of research sphere itself, there is alignment between FCDO and BEIS spend on ODA. There are slight sort of differences in that FCDO traditionally has spent money on research into development, but BEIS' spend is more on programs that are to do with research for innovation. So that's about development and commercialization, essentially. There are 2 programs within the BEIS portfolio. I won't go into too much detail, but essentially that's the Global Research Fund, and I've summarised the delivery model and on the right-hand side of the slide, and the Newton Fund, which I'm sure you've all heard about. They have different objectives, shall we say. They're aligned in the primary and secondary objectives from the IDA perspective, but in terms of meeting the OECD DAC definition, that applies equally to GCRF and Newton Fund in terms of ODA eligibility. And we can come back to that a little, perhaps, if we have time. So I'm going to pick up the pace. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I think it's useful, just before we go on to the ODA compliance aspects, just to reflect that when we talk about ODA eligibility, in this context, it really relates to the international OECD DAC standard, okay? And that is about an international flow. ODA is a measure of government spending, and it's counted only when the cash leaves the official sector, that it's concessional in nature, that it involves the primary purpose, is the central tenet of ODA eligibility, which is that the ODA spend, the activities' primary purpose must be the promotion of economic development and welfare of developing countries as the main objective, and that's regardless of where the activity takes place. And it must involve one of the countries on the ODA DAC list of recipient countries, so an ODA eligible country, and there are lots of other detailed directives. So the reason that's important is when we talk about ODA compliance, it's with reference to that international standard. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how we assure that and throughout the life cycle of the programme. So next slide, please. So this is trying to capture really the fact that assurance, evidencing ODA compliance, isn't a static action that happens either at the start or the end. It's really an intersection between the OECD DAC rules, BEIS's funding function for research and innovation, and the delivery partners actually getting the funding they need for the programs they bid for, and also ensuring throughout the life cycle of the programs that the programs remain ODA eligible. And I've just summarised the key aspects of that. We'll have a look in a little bit more detail on the next slide about how we do that throughout the life cycle of a programme. So next slide, please. So what I've tried to capture here is who does what and how and when throughout the life cycle. The first, or the purple boxes, or I should say from left to right, captures the organisational workflow. What BEIS does is on the first, in the purple boxes on the left, moving across horizontally to what the delivery partner does. UKRI, for example, will follow, who is our largest delivery partner. And in terms of what the ODA activity is and how we assure that, I've highlighted the key aspects of ODA compliance from the time that we allocate funding to the delivery partner during the life cycle of the programme delivery. So the first thing to note is that we use something called an allocation letter. And that involves 2 aspects. That has a table which allocates the amount of funding that BEIS is allocating to the delivery partner, for delivery of the ODA programme, as well as really detailed terms and conditions that make it clear that the budget allocation to the delivery partner for ODA programmes can only be spent on ODA eligible programmes per the DAC definition. And that there are also conditions for awards to beneficiaries. So following on from that, when the delivery partner designs the calls, invites applicants, and monitors delivery of projects or ODA activity throughout the life cycle of delivery, that follows through compliance and monitoring. Due diligence is also continued. We also have an ODA, excuse me, ODA assurance plan, which we use to evidence specific aspects of the terms and conditions, compliance with the terms and conditions for ODA eligibility. This in-year investment is really about where for Newton Fund and GCRF, where delivery partners are invited to bid for programmes, additional funding. There is a lot of work that's done, and we're reviewing that at the moment to really beef up the ODA eligibility and compliance aspects of that programme, of the review of programme bidding and scoring. So that is one aspect, making sure that the programmes are ODA eligible in all aspects, the international standard and the UK domestic requirements for poverty alleviation, etc., from the International Development Act. We also use quarterly progress reports as sort of more frequent two-way conversations during the lifetime of any programme or ODA activity, so the delivery partners update BEIS as the funder on any aspects of ODA eligibility, as well as risk, compliance issues, etc. But really, the key aspects in terms of ODA compliance are the quarterly delivery reports that we receive, and there are two key columns that we pay attention to, which tell us, which the delivery partners confirm that the programmes they are funding continue to be ODA eligible. There can be changes in scope, there can be graduation or qualification issues during the life cycle of programmes, some of which can be, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And we also ask for an ODA eligibility lead contact name who we can discuss any issues with. With each quarterly progress, with each quarterly report on spend, and that will tell us what has actually been spent and what is forecast to be spent against each programme line. We also pay attention to the titles and descriptions and ensure that they align with the primary purpose intention as defined by OECD DAC. And we also pay attention to the, well, they're not FCDO markers, but they are ODA markers. They are aspects, specific aspects of the programmes which all ODA spending departments in the UK need to report on, and which OECD DAC and FCDO, whom we report into, also pay attention to. So there is a lot of quality assuring of the programme reports that goes on. In addition, just as we have a number of forums, projects that link to ODA compliance. That's the Delivery and Learning Forum, where BEIS gets together with the delivery partners to talk about issues and challenges around ODA policy and reporting, monitoring and reporting. As well as you'll hopefully hear a little bit about that later, things like the due diligence, cross-delivery partner due diligence, post-award processes, which are also in review and in development. So the important thing to note is that ODA assurance, or assurance of ODA eligibility isn't something that happens discreetly. It happens across organisations throughout the life cycle of the programmes at various points, and that is what is assured and evidenced in our report to FCDO, who then report to the OECD DAC annually to confirm the spend and ODA eligibility of programmes from the UK. So, onwards. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is, I just thought it might be interesting. This is by no means a comprehensive list of some of the challenges and issues that BEIS as an ODA funder and the delivery partners face, but there are a number of issues that can cause some problem. Well, it's not problems. I think we've arrived at a level of maturity now over 3 or 4 years on the ODA portfolio. So, for example, with the OECD DAC eligibility rules, it's a huge document, 108 pages. Some of which, and this isn't a criticism of the rules, but regardless of what the definitions are, whether they are wide and detailed or whether they are one line, interpretation can involve judgment, and some aspects can be quite difficult to agree on, particularly where you are perhaps trying to iterate new guidance to delivery partners on a new aspect of operational policy, as in is offsetting, carbon offsetting for travel ODA eligible. We had a look, we had a discussion, and we had a lot of help and discussion with FCDO, who are extremely experienced and knowledgeable. So we have a lot of discussions in that sort of triangular BEIS, FCDO, delivery partners sphere. Research and innovation is a really specialist discipline area, and we do need case studies, and that perhaps is not something that we should look to OECD DAC to do, and we are addressing that, particularly around case studies for titles and descriptions. What's a good one, what's not a good one, in the OECD DAC, in the research and innovation sphere. The definition of research capacity strengthening, for example, we need good examples from actual practice and practitioners, and from programmes, which is something that we're looking at, same with equitable partnerships. So those are some difficulties. The other thing to note is that for ODA spending, that does come with an extra layer of scrutiny within the UK from UKI, the Independent Commission for Development Aid Spending, from the public. You might have noticed an article that was in the public domain this morning. So that is an extra layer of difficulty and scrutiny above normal UK domestic grants, for example. There are issues around the hierarchy of rules. Because of this subjectivity, there are issues around interpretation, not necessarily between the international standard and the UK. It can be within the UK. So the DAC definition of tied or untied aid, for example, there can be a different interpretation, perhaps between UKI and BEIS, for example. Other aspects are that the delivery pool for Newton Fund and GCRF come with a range of organisation types, resources, policies, which means that everyone can do different things. It's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. Which means it's sometimes difficult to achieve consistency of understanding and data input from all the delivery partners to the same standard, but that's something we're working through. And there is a huge amount of data to get through and a long delivery chain as well. So I think I'd better stop there because I'm going over my time, so my apologies. Next, yes, thank you. Hopefully that's given you a brief overview, and I will hand over to my colleague Ruhena for her to take you through.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bisi. That was a very comprehensive and informative presentation. If I could now invite Ruhena Begum, who is International Policy Manager at UKRI, to deliver her presentation, please.
Thank you, Tara, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about post-award ODA compliance from a UKRI perspective and give a high-level overview of our internal processes. Next slide, please. But before jumping into the post-award ODA compliance, I'd like to briefly go over the UKRI pre-award ODA process. So when applying to UKRI for ODA funding, we request as part of the application that an ODA compliance statement is included. The compliance statement is a mandatory requirement, and though not used on its own, it is used to help determine if the project meets ODA compliance requirements during our in-office checks. Next slide, please. When we ask, what we ask is for applicants to address the four following questions. And to demonstrate ODA compliance, what we are looking at is whether the country you've selected is eligible to receive ODA funds, and if so, if your project's aims, objectives, and impacts are relevant and primarily focused on the development needs of that country. So if the project is able to demonstrate it meets these requirements, then we are satisfied that it is ODA compliant. Next slide, please. So also, as part of the pre-award process, we have a peer review stage where we ask input from our reviewers and panelists who provide comments on the development relevance and the likelihood of impact the project will have in the ODA country that the project has specified. So from start to finish, ODA compliance is a key thing that we look at in our assessment process. And from a pre-award point of view, we are confident that our processes are robust in ensuring projects funded have demonstrated that they meet ODA compliance requirements. Next slide, please. So that was just a brief overview of our pre-award processes. So now I will talk about the post-award ODA compliance and give some background information on this. So the Independent Commission for Aid Impacts, who scrutinised UK aid spending, did a review of both GCRF and Newton. And they highlighted in their reports that one of the challenges is to ensure that research continues to be ODA compliant over the lifespan of the project. So what we have in place internally within UKRI to ensure post-award compliance is our funding assurance, who carry out audits of ROs and ask what measures are in place to manage changes that could affect the ODA compliance. We have an ODA T&C, which requires organisations to seek approval from UKRI and for proposed changes to grants that could affect ODA eligibility. One of our councils, Research England, monitor their ODA compliance for their QR funding, and Innovate UK have monitoring officers who monitor their projects quarterly. Larger programmes such as the GROW and the GCRF hubs have much more of an active hands-on post-award management, so which includes annual monitoring, and that includes monitoring of ODA compliance. And since 2019, UKRI have provided guidance to ODA grant holders on how to complete their research submissions to capture ODA relevant outputs, outcomes, and impacts. However, saying that for many of our Newton Fund and GCRF grants, there isn't a formal monitoring process in place for us to check ODA compliance post-award. So we began some work to address this gap. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we did was hold a workshop where delegates were asked to identify risks that could result in projects becoming non-ODA compliant, post-award and to suggest ways in which they can mitigate these risks. So in this workshop, we also presented 2 options for monitoring post-award ODA compliance, and delegates were asked for their feedback on this process. So the potential monitoring options proposed were well received, and there was a general agreement amongst the delegates that there is an importance of monitoring projects for continued ODA compliance post-award. And so I will go into the post-award monitoring process a little later, but first I just wanted to share a few outputs from the workshop. So next slide, please. So in the first session, delegates were asked to list all potential risks that could lead to a project becoming non-ODA compliant post-award, and then to highlight their top risks. So the following risks are just some of the key ones from the workshop that could potentially lead a project to becoming non-compliant post-award. So we've got things like external factors affecting research objectives and ability to deliver. So things like natural disasters, security issues, in-country conflicts, incremental changes altering the nature of the project over time, programs with flexible funding, lack of institutional support, and relationships with partners weakening or breaking down. There were other more general risks which were identified, which could also have an impact on ODA, such as changes to personnel and lack of resources. So next slide, please. So after in the first session where the delegates identified the risks, the groups were then asked to take their top risks and ask themselves the following questions on the slide and come up with some strategies to mitigate this. So below is just one example of the kind of many different strategies that will come up with in the workshop. So the suggestion was putting ODA compliance on a risk register, and then a way to mitigate the risk is having a clear understanding of ODA compliance, and how to ensure that would be perhaps implementing some training at the start of a project for the entire team, including international partners, so that everyone is on the same page when it comes to their understanding of ODA compliance. There's also building monitoring practices into the life cycle of the project, so that ODA compliance is something that throughout the whole project is always referred to. Next slide, please. So just to say, the workshop report goes into far more detail than I did in those 2 slides, but I will speak. The report will be shared after this webinar. So going on to the UKRI post-award piloting process. So in the following slides, I'm going to cover the monitoring process, which has been developed for some time with both internal and external consultation. So the aim of the monitoring process is to provide UKRI with assurance that grants funded through ODA funding streams remain eligible to be reported as ODA over their lifetime. So how we are going to go about doing this is by using ResearchFish. So UKRI uses the ResearchFish online system to collect information on the outcomes that have arisen from UKRI funding research and training. The reasons why we looked at using ResearchFish is that it is an existing system. It is already an established process, and it is a mandatory requirement for many of our grants. So by using something grant holders will already have interacted with in some way, we hope to keep this process light touch and minimize resource burden by only asking for information we need to conduct the monitoring process. So a little information on how this will work. So we will be selecting a subset of ODA grants, and the full criteria of how we go about selecting these grants is yet to be confirmed. But for the pilot, we have looked at start, end dates, and how long the grants have been active for. So once the subset have been selected, they will need to respond to the question by the ResearchFish submission deadline, which I believe falls between February and March every year. And the focus of the question set is on the project changes that could affect ODA compliance. Okay, next slide, please. So after the submission, all answers to the questions will be reviewed and analysed. And I just want to emphasise that this is not a pass-fail exercise based on the answers to the question set alone. Any projects which raise ODA concerns, or if there's anything that gets flagged to us, this is really an opportunity for us to get more information from the PI, and UKRI will work with the PI and the RO to get the project back on track if there are any concerns raised during the analysis. So this exercise is also to help us get data on our post-award ODA compliance of our projects, and again, just to offer guidance and support to our grant holders to ensure projects remain ODA compliant post-award. Next slide, please. So a little more detail on the pilot itself. So the pilot phase will run this research fish submission period, so the up and coming one in 2021. 5 research organisations have been selected to take part in this pilot. And if you're wondering why you haven't heard anything, the PIs and the ROs have been informed and will be supported throughout the pilot process. So it is likely that you weren't one of the grants selected to take part of the pilot. And it's running the pilot is also a chance to ensure the process runs smoothly and issues are identified and addressed before launching the full phase of the monitoring process. And again, this is an opportunity to gain direct feedback on the process from the research organisations and the PIs directly. Okay, next slide, please. So just as to summarise the things that I briefly went over, so the workshop report on the risks to ODA compliance and mitigation strategies. This report, it goes into much more detail in terms of the risks that could you might experience in your projects and mitigation strategies. So I will ensure that this is shared after this webinar. Again, just saying that that we're piloting the new monitoring process, and it's really a chance for us to support researchers in remaining ODA compliant post-award. And based on the outputs of the monitoring, we anticipate to publish a policy to address any areas of concern. And something I just want to leave you all with when thinking about ODA post-award compliance is asking yourself, have there been any changes to your project since receiving funding that could affect ODA compliance? And just to note that changes to projects does not mean projects become non-compliant, but it's good to have a critical think about any planned changes. And also, please do get in touch with your funding council if you plan on making any changes, or if there's any proposed changes to your project, so that they can advise and support you to ensure that your project still meets ODA. Okay, next slide. Okay, thank you, and I'll pass it back to the chair for the Q&A session.
Many thanks, Ruhena. That was excellent. If I could now invite Bisi back for the Q&A session, and also joining us is Sarah Ball, who is a Senior ODA Policy Manager from UKRI. And if I could ask attendees to put your questions in the question box, if possible, and I can see they are already coming thick and fast. So if I could start with the first question, and if I could put this question, the question is, do you think the speculation is correct that the spending review announcement will reduce the 0.7% of UK GNI commitment to ODA? Who wants to take that question?
I can take that.
Yeah, yes, please, Bisi. Yeah.
I think the key word is speculation.
Yes.
Yes, who knows? I mean, this is one of the things about working in a government department and also working in an area that has that extra layer of scrutiny, as I said. We could bounce back and forth. It would be lovely to have a multi-year spending review and clarity, but unfortunately we don't. And I think given that there is that 0.7 of GNI, you
Yes.
know, the risk is that either the 0.7 changes or the GNI changes.
Yes,
We know
yes.
GNI has changed, and therefore there is, you know, that there needs, the whole country is looking at its capability at the moment. So I'm afraid we'll just have to wait and see. Yeah.
Excellent. If I could actually take one of the pre-submitted question, and that is about how do we know when a country is likely to qualify the ODA scheme during the lifetime of a grant? As opposed, they may very well be in it at the beginning, but how do we know if they will be in it for the lifetime? I think that this is a question that was posted in advance.
Sarah?
Yeah, sorry, shall I answer that one?
Yes.
So the OECD DAC published their list of ODA recipients, and this list is valid for 3 years. So the current list is valid from 2018 until 2020. To graduate from the list, a country has to achieve the high income threshold for 3 consecutive years to ensure that they have demonstrated economic stability, and, you know, for example, to avoid them going back into a lower, the high middle income category, for example, as a result of the current economic shocks that we are experiencing because of the pandemic. So the OECD list actually identifies the countries that could potentially graduate at the or will be considered for review at the end of the 3-year cycle. So the current list identifies countries such as Panama, for example, may well graduate or will, be considered for graduation at the end of this cycle if they continue to maintain a high income status for this financial year. Of course, the current situation means it's incredibly volatile and it's quite difficult to anticipate what will actually happen when the DAC does review those financial figures. But that information is explicitly stated in the OECD DAC list. So anybody that is interested in applying for an ODA grant should review that list and should particularly pay attention to the very small print at the bottom, which identifies which countries may be considered for review. And if the country they want to work with could potentially be considered for review, that doesn't mean they can't work with that country. It just means that it would be unwise for that country to be the sole and primary beneficiary. They should also consider whether they can bring in other countries that would be the primary beneficiary so that they can maintain their ODA eligible status should that country graduate.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Sarah. We've had a question posted today and also in advance around the policy on grants that have been affected by the pandemic. Is there any comments that any of our panel members want to make around compliance for projects which have been affected by pandemic?
Happy to try and answer this. I mean, FCDO have been very good at providing extra guidance about COVID and ODA eligibility. Essentially, in terms of compliance, it's still the same focus on the primary intention and benefiting developing countries. That remains the focus. I think in terms of programme delivery, it would then be a case of looking at costed extensions or no cost extensions, simply because the programme can't be delivered as originally planned. But and we're, as Sarah was saying, perhaps in addition to some of the follow-on handouts to the workshop, we're quite happy to send out the guidance on ODA eligibility and compliance of COVID programmes, and also information on graduation as well.
Okay, that would be. Thank you.
Earlier.
Thank you. I think this is a specific. Sorry, Yeah.
I was just
Sorry.
going to say,
Yeah.
I think the really important thing here to reassure grant holders is that it's the intention of the project that's the key part for ODA compliance.
Yes.
So if you are unable to complete work packages, or in fact even complete your project altogether, that will not affect the ODA eligibility of your project, because it's the intention of the project. So that's the key. So to reassure anybody that's worried that, you know, they can't do their work or they can't deliver their project, that will not make your project non-ODA eligible. So please.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I think this is a specific question for Ruhena. It's around the time frame for the pilot monitoring.
Okay, so the pilot monitoring, the PIs and the others have been informed, and the submission period for research fish questions is open between February and March time. So after that has completed, there will be an analysis period, and we predict that outcomes from the pilot process will be announced around the autumn time.
Okay, all right. If I could, I know we are kind of prolonging this section, but colleagues who are attending have put some really good questions. So if I could actually ask the next question, which has been put in the question box, is it possible that ODA compliance is underrepresented by the fact that for many types of Newton Award, only the partner based in the ODA country, who may not be hearing as much about the compliance requirement in the UK partner, is invited to report on research fish? It was quite a long question. I'm not too sure if colleagues in UKRI wanted to comment on that.
Do you want me to have a go, Ruhena?
Yeah, sorry, if you don't mind.
I guess that's it's complex, because obviously it's only the principal investigator of any grant that is the one that's required to complete the research fish submission. As Ruhena mentioned in her presentation, we have provided, since 2019, provided grant holders with additional guidance on how to capture ODA outputs, outcomes and impacts in research fish, because we recognise it's not necessarily the best setup to capture those kind of outputs. So we would really be expecting the principal investigator to capture the sort of the ODA eligible, or the outputs impact from their Newton Fund grant, and the UK part of that grant should be ODA compliant. So I guess yes, possibly, that, you know, it may be depending on how a grant holder is actually capturing that information, it may be that some of that data is not coming through. And I think that's something that we perhaps need to have a look at and think about a little bit more about what is actually happening for Newton Fund grants. So yeah, we can take that back to the office and have a think about that.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I think linked with that, there is another question about when do you anticipate the requirement for ODA post-award compliance through research fish will be rolled out more widely to become almost like a UKRI policy?
Okay, so I can take that one. So currently we are in the process of conducting the pilot, and then once the pilot is completed and we've reviewed how it's gone and looked at the questions and the feedback and everything, we feel that the full process will be coming out the following year, so 2021, 2022. So that is when we'll launch the full process, but there will be also comms around this beforehand. So there'll be more information coming out for that also in the autumn of 2021.
Okay, that's very helpful. Right, while we have a gap and I think there is no more question in the box, I'm going to close this session if that at all possible, and thank all the speakers and all the delegates for their questions. And I would like us now to move to part 2, which focuses on due diligence. And may I invite Jennifer Sturgeon and Joe Timlin to join. Jennifer is chair of the Association of Research Managers and Administrators, ARMA, and also director of research services at Northumbria University. And Joe Timlin is research development manager at Northumbria University. So over to the two of you.
Thank you, Tara, and good afternoon, everyone. So our presentation is specifically about a project that I'm currently leading on behalf of ARMA, and this project is funded by UKRI and Research England. And it's a project that aims to take some of the pain out of the process of due diligence when working with international partners. So we know that it can be difficult and we're trying to make it easier. Could I have the next slide, please? So first of all, what is due diligence and why should you care about it if you're doing international research? So this is the kind of dictionary definition, or maybe it was Wikipedia. But due diligence is the investigation or exercise of care that a reasonable business or person is expected to take before entering into an agreement or contract with another party. It's effectively the checks that you do before you get involved in something to make sure that you really know what you're getting involved in, what the risks are, and how you can mitigate those risks. So in terms of research, what this means is checking on things like a partner's ability to deliver the actual research that you want them to deliver, their track record, their status as an organisation, their financial situation, their reputation in a number of different ways, the operating environment that they work in, and lots of different factors. And the reason that we're checking all of these things is not to say that we shouldn't be working with this partner or doing this project, although that's very occasionally the outcome, but it's really quite rare. It's more about understanding the partners that you're going to be working with and what that means for the project that you want to do, so that you can identify and mitigate any risks up front, ultimately improving the quality of the research and making it more likely that the outcomes that you want will actually be delivered. Next slide, please. And so why are we interested in this and why are we interested in it now? Well, back in 2016, UKRI changed their terms and conditions of funding to make it a requirement for lead research organisations in receipt of their funding to undertake due diligence on partners that they were going to be working with. They also made it a requirement that the lead organisation would be accountable for every penny of that grant, regardless of where it was spent. So whether it's spent by your organisation in the UK, whether it's spent by one of your collaborators overseas, whether it's spent by a subcontractor or project partner of another type, the lead organisation named on the contract and the funding agreement is the organisation that is accountable for making sure that that public money is spent in accordance with the terms and conditions and in order to actually deliver the research that is being funded. So it's a funder requirement, it's an assurance of public funds. It's also just good practice, because actually now that we've all been doing this for a few years, we have looked around in the research management community and kind of asked ourselves why we haven't been doing it for years anyway. It's one of those things, once you start doing it, you think this is, obviously we should have been checking these things, we should have been looking to mitigate risks, it's just a good thing to do. And of course, you will know that the projects that we're all involved in, the projects that are being funded, are increasingly complex. We work with an ever more diverse range of partners in the UK and internationally, which is absolutely great, but does bring more complexity and potentially more risks and a wider variety of risks. And we need to be able to mitigate and manage those risks. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the project. At ARMA, we've run a number of training sessions and good practice sharing sessions about how to undertake due diligence. And for the research managers on the call, you'll hopefully be aware that either yourself or someone else in your research office will be undertaking this due diligence process for your grants with international partners. That's not just GCRF, not just ODA, but potentially any grants with international partners that, where you might be undertaking due diligence. And if you're an academic or a researcher, hopefully you'll be aware that colleagues in your research office have been going through this process, and hopefully they'll have talked to you about it. If they haven't, I suggest that you go and ask them. So as ARMA have run these various training courses and practice sharing events for research managers about due diligence, we've increasingly come to the conclusion, and ARMA members have increasingly said to us, you know, this is great that we know how to do it, we've got a process, we understand now what it's all about, but surely it could be made easier, because we're all reinventing the wheel. So really the way that due diligence works at the moment is that each lead partner will undertake a number of checks on each overseas partner, and those checks will often involve sending a questionnaire to the overseas partner and saying, can you tell us the answers to these questions, and can you share this information about your organisation? And if 20 UK organisations want to work with the same overseas partner, that same overseas partner will receive 20 versions of a questionnaire, all aiming to do pretty much the same thing, but all slightly different versions written by slightly different universities who've got slightly different appetites for risk and slightly different processes of their own. So you can see how very quickly it becomes an industry within the UK and for our overseas partners that just becomes very bureaucratic and with lots and lots of processing and repetition. So the members pointed this out to ARMA, and we agreed that this was problematic and that there must be a better way of doing it. So we approached Research England and UKRI with the idea of a project to try to streamline some of this and make some recommendations which would take some of the pain out of the process. Research England and UKRI thankfully could see the value in what we were saying, and they funded the project, which we're now probably about 2/3 of the way through. So the slide on the screen sets out some of the organisations that are involved in the project. We've tried to look wider actually than just UKRI and Research England, and we're trying to think more broadly than GCRF and ODA, because we'd like the outcomes of this project really to be applicable to any research where due diligence is necessary, or where due diligence would help to improve the quality of that research or the approach. The project started in November 2019. It was due to finish this summer, but as with pretty much everything else, we experienced some delays due to the pandemic, and so we've a revised out end date of the end of January 2021. If I could have the next slide, please. So this is the challenge that the project is trying to address. The fact that those terms and conditions changed in 2016, it took the sector a little while to start understanding what this was all about and what they needed to do with regards to due diligence. So in higher education terms, it's still a relatively new phenomena to us. It's time consuming, lots of duplication, as I've already said, slightly different approaches. And it's done as a point in time exercise at the moment. So you do it once, generally at the beginning of the grant, and then if everything's okay, you set off with your project, and anything could change over the 1, 3, 5 years of your project. But generally speaking, the due diligence often isn't checked, kind of referred back to, and that's a bit of a problem. It's quite difficult to verify some of the information in due diligence. So you might say to a partner, how do you do this, or what would you do about the other risk if it happened, and the partner can give you an answer, and you kind of have to take that at face value. And if poor decisions are made at anywhere down the line for this process, it affects the whole research project. It affects the partners themselves, because part of how due diligence improves the quality of a project is by enabling the lead organisation to put certain supports in place for partners sometimes. So if we have poor information along the way, it might be that the necessary supports aren't put in place for partners. It could lead to reputational or financial risk for the lead organisation. It could lead to not the best use of public funding. It affects the funders as well. And obviously all of these things kind of taken together affect the success of the GCRF and ODA programmes. So they're just some of the reasons why we're undertaking the project. Next slide. And so these are the things that we're trying to deliver then through the project. So first of all, a core questionnaire for gathering due diligence information from partners. So as I said, at the moment, each university or each lead research organisation has created its own questionnaire in the past, all trying to achieve broadly the same thing, but asking questions in slightly different ways, making it quite hard for partners to fill in lots of different versions or variations on this. So we've in fact already done this part of the project. There is now a core questionnaire for due diligence, which was developed in broad consultation with those organisations that you saw on the previous slide, with a wide range of ARMA members in the UK and a number of other overseas organisations who form a challenge group for the project, whereby we kind of check our ideas and proposals with them, and they tell us how things would work in their particular country or setting, and we adjust and so on. So that questionnaire is out there, and you can find it on the ARMA website, and we can circulate a link to that with the slides at the end of the event today. The second output is that we're looking to scope out proposals for what we're calling a clearinghouse for due diligence. A clearinghouse is effectively a fancy word for a database, whereby instead of each university in the UKI or each lead research organisation contacting the partner and saying, can I have your answers to the questionnaire, and lots of questionnaires flying about by email, the idea with a clearinghouse would be all the answers to the questionnaire go into one system, and then whichever lead research organisation wants to work with that partner, they come to that system to get the answers instead of having to go and chase up the partner for them again. And we would have some workflow and approvals and reporting and kind of clever features built into the clearinghouse there as well. And then the third part of the project is to scope a national service for due diligence, which would be looking at how we could go over and above the clearinghouse to provide other support to UK and overseas organisations who are involved in this project. And I'm going to pass you over now to my colleague Joe, who's going to tell you a little bit more about each of those parts of the project and what they're aiming to deliver.
Excellent, thank you, Jenny. Just take the next slide, please. Excellent. So I think this is just a quick overview here of who is actually in the project team. So you'll see there the various membership organisations represented that Jenny just spoke to. So Jenny's PI, Lindsay Dixon, who's also an ARMA director, Simon Kerridge at UKRI, Simon Newitz, who is at Northumbria and chair of the Learning Development Group at Buffdug, and myself as project officer when I'm not being research development manager at Northumbria. So I'll just take the next slide as well, please, which just shows again the various people involved in our steering group. Again, just trying to bring together a broad range of people to consult and to keep us on the right track as we go through. And I'll just take the next slide, please. And finally, the challenge group there. So you can see who has been working with us to provide challenge, to provide critique and insight to the group in the development of the three outputs, which Jenny's just given an overview of. So we've got a lot of representation from funders, from government departments, various mission groups and sector bodies, as well as colleagues out there in partner countries and international partners across the board. So it's a large project and kind of getting making sure that we can hear everybody and kind of feed that into the process. So I'm going to take you through now in a little bit more detail the three outputs that we're working on, and I'm sure this will generate some questions for the Q&A afterwards as well. So next slide, thank you. The first deliverable for the project was the questionnaire and guidance. So as Jenny said, this was just to try and bring together some of the divergent approaches that we have seen, and make it easier ultimately for international partners in that they can expect to see the same set of questions coming in from each UK research organisation. The questionnaire was developed in consultation with ARMA members at the Good Practice Exchanges, as well as African research and administrators in events in Tanzania in 2019 and South Africa this year in 2020. So it's been developed using this feedback and insights by the project team, and then taken to the steering group and the challenge group for further discussion. The first iteration of the questionnaire and guidance was published this year on the 30th of July and is recommended for use by UKRI. At this point in time, it isn't mandated for use, but rather it's recommended for use by UKRI and intended to be adopted so that international partners can expect to receive the same set of questions when dealing with due diligence requests. So it's not expected as well. If you go away and have a look at it, I think there are around 56 questions in total. It's not expected to be used in its entirety in all cases, but rather questions can be selected and used according to the RO's risk appetite and the appropriate to the perceived risk of a given project. So, you know, it might be a different set of questions for a 5-year programme compared to, you know, a £5,000 QR GCRF grant. We're also still gathering feedback for the questionnaire, and we will be producing a second iteration, which will be published in January 2021. So if you would like to get in touch with us with any feedback, there's an address there in the slides, inquiries@arma.ac.uk, and we'll try and feed that into the second iteration. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the second deliverable is a clearinghouse or repository, or indeed a database for completed due diligence questionnaires. And the hope here is that we can produce an IT solution or something similar, which will mean that partners can submit completed due diligence questionnaires, which can then be accessed by UK research organisations or other international partners as appropriate, and thereby reduce the duplication of effort that we're seeing across the sector, and we're having reported from ARMA members and international partners alike. So in addition to the consultation that we undertook with ARMA members and African research managers and administrators, we also consulted with colleagues in the United States who designed and implement the Federal Demonstration Partnership Clearinghouse. Those of you who've applied for US funding may have come across it already. But those conversations led us to 3 solutions based on their experiences, which we've then kind of gone away and worked up as a project group, and have since taken to the challenge group. The 3 levels are tiered and designed to be kind of a quick and easily implementable solution through to a much more comprehensive system. So at level 1, we have suggested and discussed a staffed inbox, which would be a simple, due diligence @ email address where completed questionnaires can be stored, and then that inbox can be contacted and due diligence questionnaires can be requested from it. A more bespoke system, which would be online, so level 2, where users who have submitted a completed due diligence questionnaire, which has been uploaded, are granted access to a database in which all completed due diligence questionnaires are available to view. And finally, a comprehensive online system, which might take the form of a grants management system that we're used to seeing in research administration. But importantly, this system we're proposing would house the questionnaire itself. and have some additional workflow capabilities so that organisations can seek approval. Within there, they can grant access to certain aspects of the data that they want organisations to see, or areas where they might, for example, want that information available only by request. And that aims to address the kind of the duplication of effort, but also some of that point in time exercise that Jenny mentioned, and hopefully it would provide a much more easy kind of process to update and maintain due diligence questionnaires and data to support projects as they go on. Okay, next slide, please. And finally, the national service. So this is a part of the project which we're very much in the middle of, I think it's fair to say, and we are currently scoping what a national service for due diligence and international research might provide to UK and international partners. So at the moment, we are considering that we would provide a technical support to the chosen IT solution, which would be particularly important if we were to go down the level 3 kind of route, as well as a helpline support for users in completing the questionnaire. We would also be thinking about providing some kind of knowledge base for signposting to sources of in-country information. Jenny talked about the difficulty sometimes of verifying information from overseas, so it might signpost to local or national guidance so that organisations can be reassured of answers given, or local science and innovation networks, for example, all there to support ROs in interpreting the information that's contained within the questionnaires in order to make decisions about their risk appetite and ultimately how the project goes forward. And then finally, we've talked about a forum or message board to kind of really take advantage of the good practice and the experience that UKRIs will be bringing, as well as international partners to this process, and providing a way for people to contact each other and that community of practice to develop. And finally, the cost will be particularly important in our recommendations, and kind of thinking through what the cost benefit is of such an intervention will inform our final recommendations. So you may have been contacted via the ARMA membership lists, or if you're an international partner, by your UKRO that you're partnering with, to complete a survey which closed last week on the 20th of November. So we've requested a lot of data from organisations on due diligence processes before the questionnaire and guidance were available, and whether they've been using them since, and if this has given any improvement to the process. So that will underpin some of our assumptions and our recommendations, and that will be the final point. So I think, Jenny, unless there's anything you'd like to add at that stage, we can probably go over to the Q&A.
I think we can go to the Q&A. Thank you, Joe.
So we'll invite Tara back, please.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you both. What a helpful, pragmatic and useful project this is for all of us who are involved in the due diligence aspects. We have already some questions which is coming, and those who are attending, please use the question box to put your question. But perhaps I can start by reading the first posted question, which is around the recently published UUKi guidance on managing risks in internationalization. And the question is whether, as part of this consolidated approach, you are actually looking more broadly onto risks and due diligence, not just the research aspects.
Yeah, so that report is about a broad range of risks, which include security risks, for example,
yes,
in international research. The scope of this project is quite specific in that it's about that process of undertaking due diligence. But in our recommendations about services that a national service might provide to support the sector, we will be looking at recommendations on whether we should, whether a national service should take a broader view. So should a national service, for example, as well as signpost into information about the types of due diligence risks we've just talked about, should it also signpost to kind of sources of good practice information with regards to security risks and export controls and so on. So that wasn't actually within the scope of our original project, but we are in conversation with UUKi about that particular report, and we are looking at how it will feature in our recommendations.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. The next question is quite a specific question about the questionnaire. And the question is, the core questionnaire does not appear to ask for partner organizations' registered address. And is there a reason for this? Because it's something that has to be obtained separately for the records.
So off the top of my head, I don't remember whether the address is one of the 56 questions, but it would seem odd that it's not.
Okay.
So we can take that away and have a look at it.
Okay. I have another question which says, given that the university and the PI are ultimately responsible, do you think a university will accept a database as the thing to complete the due diligence? And will the university trust the process, allowing others to access the due diligence?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, because it enables us to make a point that we probably should have made in the presentation. So this project is about streamlining the process of due diligence, but it's not about ultimately making the decision on whether the risk is acceptable or what the mitigating action should be. It's about getting research organisations more quickly to that point at which they're able to make a decision. But the decision on whether to work with the partner, the decision on whether to accept the risks or how to mitigate the risks always lays with the research organisation, because as the person asking the question has rightly pointed out, the risk lies with that research organisation and with the PI, and no third party can take that decision away from them. So it's about taking away some of the pain and getting to the information that allows you to make the decision. And then I suppose there's a second part of that question there, which is about people's willingness to put the information into the database in the first place. Some information that we ask for in these questionnaires is in the public domain, so it's a case of just pulling it together. Other information could potentially be felt to be sensitive. So there are questions, for example, about whether there have been instances of fraud at an organisation. We would, in the clearinghouse, we would look to restrict the access to certain pieces of information. So we wouldn't be kind of making things public that an organisation might want to be for that information to be more carefully managed in terms of who access would be given to. So we'd make open what we could, but if there are things that are more sensitive, we would protect them. There'd also be very little personal data in terms of, from a GDPR point of view, there'd be very little personal data collected except for kind of names and business email addresses of people filling in the information. But obviously we would be, any system would be GDPR compliant as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Jennifer. I have another really excellent question on clearinghouse, and it's to do with the language issues. Part of the current due diligence is to assess the financial risks, and many overseas documentation is not in English. How will that be handled? It's causing significant added time and cost to universities at the moment, especially for large projects with many partners across many countries.
Yeah, so this is partly related to the clearinghouse, but also to what additional services a national service might provide over and above the system itself. And we do recognise that language is a big factor here. So one of the recommendations we'll definitely be making is that the questionnaire itself should be available in multiple languages. One of the things we've not decided yet, and which we're still very much open to feedback on, if people would like to email the address that's in the slides, is whether we should offer a service to translate some of the documents when they come back. So the answers to the questionnaire and any associated policy documents and so on. So that's something that a service could do. It could get an official translation and help hold the translated version for UK partners to access. Or we could leave that responsibility where it currently sits, which is with the UK research organisations. And we're very open to feedback as to whether that would be a valuable thing for a national service to do or not.
Okay, thank you. I have a specific question whether UK CDR has been involved or consulted during the development of the questionnaire.
So UK CDR as a collective specifically haven't been consulted, although they're aware of the project. Some of the organisations that are part of UK CDR are also part of some of our groups that we're working with, so there's some crossover. But UK CDR will certainly be receiving a copy of our final report and recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Now I have a question from James Evans, and thank you, James, for putting your name in the question box, from University of Manchester. What relationship do you have with AAS Global Grant Community Initiative?
So the Global Grant Community Initiative are represented on our challenge group. So they're one of the organisations that we talk to about the project that we're undertaking and how our recommendations will work. But we are a separate project and separate initiative to that particular initiative. Our project is slightly broader than that initiative, so it's looking at a range of types of due diligence, not only financial due diligence, and it's also aimed at being truly global, not only Africa based. But we are aware of them and we work closely with them and in communication with them.
Excellent, thank you both very much. I'm going to wrap up now because we are the time flies. We have had really excellent lists of questions for both sessions. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Jennifer. And thank you all who attended the session this afternoon. It's a very important topic. It's close to all our daily tasks as we manage these type of grants and activities. So many thanks for all of you for attending and for all the speakers. And I just want to remind you of the next session in the series, which the slide is now showing. That will be the final session in the series on 2nd of December. Thank you all and have a very safe week. Goodbye.